Hello everybody, I'm Dan. Welcome to my Java tutorial series. Throughout my tutorials I will teach you Java using just Notepad and the command prompt. The order in which my tutorials are organized on both my website at javacjava.com and my YouTube playlist is designed to maximize learning by building on concepts from prior tutorials. This tutorial is about final primitive variables. I'm going to open up my website here to javacjava.com, click on the menu, and in the pop-out menu, I'll select Java OOP Tutorials. That's my Object-Oriented Programming Tutorials page. I'm going to scroll down here to Final Primitive Variables. I'm going to click on that. And this tutorial is specifically for the primitive variables and marking them final. There are two types of variables. You got primitive data type variables, and then you got reference variables. So these are this tutorial is dedicated to primitive data type variables. The keyword final can be applied to many things. In the next few tutorials, I will explore how it affects the behavior of methods, classes, and variables. When the keyword final is applied to primitive data types, it will prevent a primitive data type variable from changing its value once it has been initialized. A final primitive type variable can only be assigned initialized or assigned a value once. Once it is assigned a value, it cannot be changed ever again. The value does not need to be assigned when the final primitive type variable is declared. This kind of a final primitive type variable is called a blank final variable. Now, a blank final instance variable must be assigned a value inside of a constructor, or a compiler error will occur. A blank final local variable must be assigned a value before it is used. The optional common naming convention for final primitive type variables is to be in uppercase with an underscore separating the words. I'm already splitting up the final primitive type variables and the final reference variables into separate tutorials, so I was debating of splitting this tutorial into a part 1 and part 2. I decided against that, and I just want to let you know that this tutorial will throw a lot your way. With that being said, let's go ahead and come down here and get started. We'll highlight all this code. Hit Control-C to copy, or right-click and select copy. I'm going to move the browser off screen. I've got a shortcut to the command prompt on my desktop over here, but if you don't, you can simply right-click, go New, Shortcut, type in CMD, Next, and Finish. It's just that easy. Let's go and open up our command prompt, type in Java-C for the Java compiler, press Enter. You should see a whole bunch of stuff scroll by. If you don't, then go ahead and watch my tutorial on installing the Java development kit. You want to make sure you get that installed and configured properly before continuing. CLS to clear the screen, CD space /, CD is short for change directory, / tells it to go to the root. We're going to make a directory called Java, MD Java, right? Then we're going to change directory to the Java folder. Now I already had the Java folder there, so it existed, but if it didn't, it would go ahead and create it for you. I'm going to create another directory under here, and I'm just going to call this final primitives, and we'll go ahead and change directories to the final primitives folder we just created. Notepad final primitives.java. Final primitives.java is the name of my source code file here, also known as a compilation unit. Go ahead and hit Control-V to paste, or right-click and select paste, whatever your preference is. Let's go ahead and save this here. Okay, so in the final primitives.java source code file, there's 3 classes. And the first thing I'm going to do is just save this and run it, right? I'm not even going to go over anything with you here, because I'm going to step through it after that. So clear our screen, type in Java-C. And then we'll go ahead, to compile it, and then we'll go ahead and, let's see, we want to invoke the final primitives class, because that's the entry point right up here of the one with the main method entry point on it. The other two are just set up to basically become object instances. Okay, so we're going to look for 127, 45 true, some lines, and volume equals 100. All right, let's go ahead and go through the actual source code here. So what I've got is I've got a final instance tester class and a final local tester class. And I've kind of split these up because when I put them all into one giant class, it just looked like spaghetti. So I kind of want to split this into two little sections here. So this class will be playing around with instance variables and marking them final and seeing what happens and playing with the rules on those too. And in this class down here, we'll be marking local variables final and playing around with seeing what happens with those. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to do in the main method entry point is I am going to create a reference variable fit. That's a final instance tester object type. And we'll set it equal to a new final instance tester. And we're passing it 127 casted as a byte. Okay? Now let's go down here and talk about the final instance tester class here. So here we got the final, right? Keyword in front of the primitive data type byte, and then we use the naming convention all in uppercase and then separated with a semicolon. So, and this particular one doesn't have any sort of like equals 0, right? This is right off the bat, I wanted to throw a blank final instance variable right into the equation there. Okay. Now on the next line here, everything in here as far as all these instance variables are going to be marked final. Okay. Then we've got an int data type, int test, and I'm initializing that, setting its value to 45, right? Now one of the things that I specified up there is once you set its value, it cannot be changed ever again. So int test is now equal to 45, you can't change it ever again. The next thing I'm going to do here is just set boolean true value equal true, right? That can never change again, and a final char upper A equal to a character literal uppercase A there. All right. Now I think what I'm going to do is delete these, hit shift delete just to take those two constructors out here. So the first thing that I want to do is just show you, let's say for example, we know we need to initialize it and assign it a value before we actually go ahead and use it. So it seems like we should be able to go ahead and put in the display values here, just, you know, assign byte test the value of 127. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and save that and just even try to compile that right off the bat just to show you what happens there, right? So we get an error. Constructor final instance tester in class final instance tester cannot be applied to given type, right? Oh, whoops. Hold on. All right. Ignore this error, this first error up here. We're just primarily concerned with the second error down here. Cannot assign a value to variable byte test, right? And that basically must be initialized in a constructor. So I'm just going to, it's complaining about this byte 127 up here because we don't have a matching constructor when I took that out. So I'm just going to save this, recompile it, let's clear our screen so we can see the proper error here, right? Error, cannot assign a value to final variable byte test, right? That's basically what it's complaining about. It's like, okay, well, byte test is marked final here and we're trying to assign it a value. So why can't we assign it a value? Well, that's a good question. And the answer is that we have to have, we can only initialize an instance variable marked final, one of these blank final ones, inside of a constructor, right? Now, the cool thing about that is we can have, you know, we can assign it right here, you know, a 0, or we can assign it to a parameter. We only have one chance to assign it something, and it must be assigned in the constructor portion of it here. So I'm going to go ahead and put my byte back here, 127, right? So when we call the constructor that matches this byte, we're passing it a byte argument, it comes down here and says, okay, I'm going to invoke the constructor that matches that. It's not this, because this one doesn't have anything in there. It's this one right here, paramval. So then we can set paramval equal to byte test, and everything is all good, right? We can go ahead and compile that. Oh, whoops. We got to recomment this line out right here that I put in there, because that's giving us an error, right? That we've already initialized that. Let's clear our screen. recompile it. Everything's good. Let's go ahead and run it. Okay, and basically in the display values, when I invoke that up here, display values, the only thing it's going to do is print off the value of byte test, int test, and true value. These 4 instance variables there. So that's why we're seeing 127, 45, and true, right? 127, right, is assigned via a constructor parameter right here. 45 is, we're initializing it and assigning it a value right up here when we're declaring it too. So, and then, you know, I didn't display the A in there, but that's all good. I'm not sure why I missed that. I'll just go ahead and throw it in here real quick. For A. We'll just recompile that and run it. Okay, so 127, 45, true, and A, right? Those are our values there. The next line that I want to do here is just to show you that this is going to cause an error because you cannot change the value of a variable marked final once it has been initialized. So let's go ahead and save that. Try to compile it again here. Let's clear our screen, Java C, F8. Okay. So we get error, cannot assign a value to final variable int test, right? So that just reiterates that point, that once you can only assign a value once, right? And we did it when we initialized it, so it can never change again, right? If right before here, if we tried to do upper A equals B, right? We're going to get an error there too. Just want to drive this point home here. Right? Cannot assign a value to final variable upper A, right? So that won't work there too. Once a variable has been assigned a value and initialized a value, you know, it can never be changed again. And then the blank final instance value is the only thing you have to remember up here, that you have to initialize it before you use it, but it can only be initialized inside of a constructor. Right? Either the no argument constructor or an overloaded constructor. So that is basically how how final applies to instance variables. Now let's talk about how final applies to local variables here. So now I've got another class down here called final local tester. And up here I've got just a plain old local, well, a short length equals 4, right? And then a final short height equals 4 as well. Then I'm doing a final local tester reference variable FLT, a final local tester type, setting it equal to a new final local instance object, a reference to that object, and it is a blank constructor. As a matter of fact, there's not even a constructor here. It's just going with the default one that's implicitly put in there. Okay, so that's fairly simple enough. And then basically what I've gotten here is just a single calculate volume method. Now I just want to talk about these variables right here. I've marked one of them as final, right? But basically we've got a short, and an int. So method parameter variables are basically implemented as local variables. And you'll hear me call them local variables all the time, right? They have the same visibility, right? They're not visible outside of the method, and the same lifetime. They're created when invoking a method and destroyed on method return. Now, technically speaking, Oracle splits parameter and local variables into separate categories, but to my knowledge, there is no difference between the two. So sometimes I'll say parameter variables, sometimes I'll say local variables, but for the purposes of this tutorial, the same rules all pretty much apply there. Okay. And I'll show you some interesting stuff on this. So the first parameter that we're going to be receiving, I'm marking it final short length, right? The next one's a short height, and the next one is an int width. And this is, I mix and match these primitive data types on purpose. And the reason being is I want to kind of reiterate something as far as as far as type promotion goes here on the return value there. So back up to here, right? I'm displaying to the console using the print line method the string literal volume equals, and then plus our reference variable FLT, which is our final local tester reference variable, and then invoking the .calculate volume. And then I'm setting an argument length, and we know length is just a plain old short, excuse me, and height is a final short height, right? Set equal to 4, and then I'm just passing in a plain old 4, right? So it will come down to the calculate volume. So the argument, the first argument is just basically a plain old short, the value of 4. The next one is a final short height with a value of 4, and then a plain old 4 for the width technically down here. So I'm going to just remove this crap here just so it cleans up, looks a little better here. But basically, so the first one coming in, right, the argument up there was just a regular old value of 4, and I'm marking the length parameter here as final, right, short 4. And now the height that was passed in as an argument up there, it was a final short height, and then just plain old int width of 4. Okay. Now, the first thing I'm going to try to do is just go ahead and add 1 to the length. Okay. Now that will create an error. Let's go ahead and save that, and let's run. Let's compile. Let's clear our screen just to keep that clean. Java C 8. Okay, so we get an error. Final parameter length may not be assigned, right? And its length is the name of the thing there, right? So it's basically saying that, you know, somewhere in between when we pass this as an argument length, and when it received it as a parameter, and we're trying to access it now inside of the method, Java is saying, okay, it's now technically been final short length, and then somewhere in there it assigned it to equals 4. Okay, so that's exactly what it is right now. Okay, now where that occurred, I don't know, and it's not really relevant. So, but we just can't change its value if we mark it final, and we can't change its value inside of the method here. Okay, now the next one is plain old short height, right? And as you'll notice, we can go in and do ++ on it here because it doesn't error out, right? And even though we passed the argument was a final short height, right? It's not passing any sort of reference to a value or reference to like an instance of something like that. It's actually passing the number 4. It's no different than if we had, you know, just put like casted this as short 4, right? Okay, so that is what's occurring there. That is sorry, that's height. Okay, so we can take our height down here and ++ it, right? Because the parameter variable height, short data type, the parameter primitive data type height of short data primitive type. Boy, I'm really slaughtering that. Well, anyway, I don't have a final here, so we can go and do whatever we want because it's just at some point in time, it's going to simply say like this. Somewhere in between when we pass it the final short height up here, right? It's going to just come across as 4, right? This particular height parameter value here, which is local to this method, only contains 4, and we can go ahead and add 1 to it and change it 5. Same with the width. I'm going to go ahead and add 1 to it there as well, just for grins and giggles. So, all right, if I haven't confused you enough at this point, I hope you're still following me. Now I'm going to create a final local variable of int data type, and I'm going to call it enlarger. Now notice I'm not setting a value or anything like that, right? So this is actually a final blank, or a blank final local variable, okay? And what I'm going to do is go ahead and assign it a value of 2, because we have to assign it before we can actually like use it down here, and I use it in this expression down here. So as you can see, that works no problem there, right? If we try to, I should say enlarger. Okay, if we try to add 1 to enlarger at that point, right, we're going to get an error, right? Because the same rules apply for local variables there too. Variable enlarger might have already been assigned, right? And we cannot change the value of a variable marked final once it has been initialized, and it was initialized to 2 right there, okay? So that's good there. Now in this next one, I'm initializing a variable shrinker of primitive int data type, and I'm assigning it the value of 2 right off the bat, and it's marked as final. Okay, so we cannot do something like do shrinker minus minus, right? If we save this and we come up here and we try to recompile that again, we get another error, cannot assign a value to final variable shrinker, right? So basically, we just cannot change the value of a variable marked final once it has been initialized. I'll go ahead and comment that. Now what I did is I just did return length times height times width, which is like a calculate volume, and then I did times enlarger divided by shrinker, right? And enlarger is 2, and then divider is 2. So essentially, you know, basically in the order of operations here, it comes along and it says length, right? Length, what are we getting across for length? We're getting 4 across for length. And we're not changing 4's value at all. We can't, because we've marked it as final. So 4 times height. Now, we were passed this final short height in as an argument here, right? But when it received it as a parameter, it's able to go ahead and change it, because we don't have a final as a local variable within this method, or a parameter variable, I should say, according to Oracle there. But so we can go ahead and add 1 to it. So now we get 4 times 5, and same thing with width, times 5. So 4 times 5 is 20, times 5 is 100, times our enlarger, which is 2, and that's 200, and then divided by our shrinker, which is 2, divided by 2, which is 100, right? So these two basically cancel each other out there. But I just thought I'd throw them in there so we can see how the final blank final local variable works there, and then the a regular final variable, local variable there as well. Now, if we wanted to adhere to the optional common naming convention, right, we would actually call this enlarger, all in uppercase. And we would do that with every single instance here. Okay, now if we save this and recompile, we can see it makes absolutely no difference. Okay, now for readability though, it kind of tells us, oh, okay, right on. I can, you know by the convention. Let's do the same thing with, I left several of the final variables in this whole entire project as just, lowercase stuff, normal camel case stuff there. But now all of a sudden we're starting to be able to see which variables just right off the bat are actually final variables. In other words, their values can't change once they're set. And the only other one that we've got to do down here is the length. All right, so what did I do? That was in the comment there anyway. Okay, save there. We got one more up here in the initial one here, and that is basically this right here. All right, now we're saved. What am I doing? Let's just clear the screen here. Let's compile it, and let's run it. Okay, so we get our volume equals 100 down there. So that basically concludes this tutorial there. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this, close out of that, and leave you with some final thoughts. So the most important thing to learn from this tutorial is that once a final primitive variable or primitive type variable is initialized, its value can never be changed. I know this tutorial most likely caused some level of confusion. I was debating of splitting this tutorial into part 1 and 2. I figured that if I did so, you would be watching 2 tutorials anyway. If you got everything, great. If not, then feel free to watch it again. That concludes this tutorial. Thanks for watching.